I truly believe that our sector is the safety net for society. We build communities that are strong, resilient, vibrant, and connected, where people feel that they can belong and where there's a high sense of community well-being. It's not an optional sector. It is essential. And we need to remember how powerful we can be when we come together and approach the relationship with government from this place of strength and true partnership.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. While our sector has several touch points with the federal government, no ministry or department is responsible for improving the nonprofit sector's policy environment or economic landscape. In this episode, we're going to explore the concept of a home in government and hear from one leader in one province where, over the past few years, their provincial leaders have created a place inside the machinery of government to support charities and nonprofits. I'm delighted to welcome Zahra Esmail, CEO of Vantage Point in Vancouver, to our podcast. Thank you for joining me here today.
It's my pleasure, Bruce.
So before digging into the home and government question, tell us a little bit about your organization. What does it do?
Sure, Bruce. Thank you again for having me here today. My name, as you mentioned and pronounced very well, is Zahra Esmail. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm delighted to be calling in from my home office on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm an uninvited settler on these lands, and my family migrated here from India originally via East Africa, and it's been a privilege to be able to lay our roots down here and raise my daughter. I have an 8-year-old daughter on these beautiful territories. I am the CEO of an organization called Vantage Point, and Vantage Point is formerly Volunteer Vancouver, but our current mandate for the last several decades has been to strengthen the capacity of nonprofit organizations across British Columbia. So we actually work with charities and nonprofits through education, training, consulting, and convening. We're exploring in early stages of exploring the development of the BC Nonprofit Network. And so through that work, we interact with organizations that build community on over 200 nations across this province. And that's what we do in a nutshell.
That's terrific. It's such important work. And also interesting to hear how the organization has evolved over time. So as we have discussed, we're going to spend our time today really talking about a home in government. And in 2020, the BC government appointed its first ever Parliamentary Secretary, Community Development and Nonprofits. This was the first time charities and nonprofit organizations had a Parliamentary Secretary in the BC government. So Zahra, can you tell us a little about the relationship between the sector and the Parliamentary Secretary? How does it work and what are they responsible for?
Yeah, absolutely. So in preparing for this podcast, I actually checked in with some members of my team to get some of the history. I've been with Vantage Point for a little over a year and a half, and a lot of that early creation of this Parliamentary Secretary role came through advocacy from sector players. So Vantage Point several years ago had partnered with Vancouver Foundation and several other organizations to advocate for the creation of a home for nonprofits and government in BC. From what I understand, we were asking initially for a minister, but ended up with a parliamentary secretary. And we were very happy that, some of the calls had been heard and that this role had been created. There was a lot of excitement from the community that we had this new position that could increase the visibility of our sector within government and generally communicate with us directly. I think one of the hurdles that nonprofits often have is that we interface with so many different ministries for mental health, housing, environment, health, and oftentimes social services, of course. Oftentimes, the conversations can feel different, and it can be unclear if you're interfacing with maybe 5 or 6 or 7 ministries. And if there's a challenge, who do you go to? And so this parliamentary secretary role gave us a lot of hope as a community. If I speak on behalf of all nonprofits, at least this was the theory of what many people wanted, was a mechanism within government to have direct conversations And really so that our sector could stop being overlooked. Oftentimes business and education and a number of other areas, they have higher visibility. When strategies are created, an approach to how to support them is built right in. And nonprofits maybe can peripherally fit with some of those areas. Many of us run like small businesses, but we're unique and our circumstances are unique. And we really aspired to stop being overlooked. I'll just share a little bit of the background, actually. When COVID-19 fell upon all of us, very quickly, a lot of nonprofits in BC recognized that we were being overlooked, that a lot of the pandemic supports were not including nonprofits. And the team at Vantage Point worked with some partners to start doing research on the sector. We learned from our counterparts in other provinces and from Imagine Canada. And we did a state of the sector survey. It led to a first report, which was called, I think, No Immunity. And the second report was called Unraveling. And it really painted a picture of growing crisis. And my understanding is that the data that we collected helped the government to really understand that nonprofits were unique, needed their own sort of position, and led, at least in part, to the creation of this role. So the data really helped us be heard to some extent. And we do see the Parliamentary Secretary as a partner that we can work with to strengthen and uplift the profile of nonprofits within government and to ensure that nonprofit issues are on the table across ministries, like I mentioned before, and also to help build our capacity in terms of demystifying government processes and timelines for the sector. Sometimes there's things that we want, at least for me, I don't always understand the mechanisms that government has to go through in order to get things done. So it's also helping bridge that gap in understanding, because we really should be partners working towards similar goals as opposed to an adversarial relationship, which can sometimes feel uncomfortable.
That's super interesting. It's also fascinating to hear the role that data might have played during the conversation, ensuring that, it really is kind of a data-informed discussion. I mean, certainly since I've been around with Imagine Canada, the question of a home in the federal government has been around. And one of the things that I've observed is that there is a lot of agreement around the need for a home in government, but there's almost little or no consensus around what the form or function should be. So you've pretty clearly articulated how the Parliamentary Secretary structure has been in place. But from your perspectives, what have been the positive aspects of this model in the province of BC? What's worked well so far?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the Parliamentary Secretary was really able to look at a lot of the data from those two reports that I mentioned, and there were so many roundtable conversations, many town halls, lots of convening with different subsector groups and nonprofits across the whole province in different regions. Some issues are very unique and specific, and then other issues affect us all, regardless of subsector size or geography. And so the Parliamentary Secretary really seemed to be able to pull out some of the nuances of what was going on, measure that against the data that had been collected, and create some real solutions to support the sector, particularly through rough times created by the pandemic. One tangible example is the development of the $30 million Recovery and Resiliency Fund for nonprofits in BC. That was particularly geared to smaller nonprofits that had a budget size of $1 million or less, with some particular emphasis on organizations that were serving or led by equity-seeking community members or rural and remote organizations. But really thinking about which organizations are able to face the hurdles of the pandemic better, and then who's falling through the cracks. So this Recovery and Resiliency Fund was one really clear example of how our voices could be heard and how government could create a solution. It was a $30 million fund, the first of its kind in BC, and has had quite a bit of impact. What I loved about that is they also worked through 3 partners to distribute those funds. There was New Relationship Trust, Vancouver Foundation, and United Way of British Columbia. And so even the way in which the funds were administered, I think, was responsive to what the Parliamentary Secretary was hearing from stakeholders across nonprofits and charities in BC. The position has also encouraged collaboration within the sector outside of specific subsectors or regions. And it's allowed us to start shifting our thinking to look at things for the nonprofit sector as a whole. And, I grew up in social services. My whole career has been in the nonprofit sector. And we do tend to often compete because of the way that the sector is set up. There's kind of a bit of a scarcity mentality. There's realities of scarcity as well. I'm not saying it's unjustified, but having this role that was created for nonprofits overall, for many of us, I think made us step back from our unique positions in terms of the types of programming we were doing to look at our sector as a whole and start thinking about how we could shape the narrative with government to find our strength together, our collective strength, our collective potential and capacity, and to really start to lift the conversation we were having with government as well. I think it's been a signal to the sector that the government is more receptive or cares about us. And I think a lot of people have felt more pride and sort of just validation that we matter in the creation of the role. And a lot of nonprofits are starting to feel that their ideas and thoughts are more welcome in government processes in terms of budget recommendations or sharing policy ideas or providing feedback. It feels a little bit more welcome to be able to do that. And we're all learning. I think many of us have taken the signal that if there is now an appetite from government to hear from us, we also need to be upping our game in terms of government relations. So I think more and more organizations are investing time, energy, and supporting each other also to learn how government relations can and should work. I'm a work in progress. It's an area that's not that familiar for me. And so I'm learning from my colleagues and other colleagues in the sector to figure out how actually this partnership could work and how nonprofits can start to show up in a way that government expects us to show up in order to be taken seriously as well.
That's a really terrific list of positives or upsides since the model has been put in place. And I know that in Canada, there just aren't that many examples of having a permanent home within the machinery of government. So, like anything, there's positives and then there's sometimes the things that didn't go so well. So maybe let's flip the coin now and talk a little bit about expectations that were missed, struggles that the sector has faced in this particular model. Really just looking for you to share any observations you've had since the Parliamentary Secretary model came into being.
It's a great question. For me, one of the most awkward things about it, and I've had a really, really great time working with that position, the Parliamentary Secretary. We had Parliamentary Secretary Nikki Sharma for a few years, and now we've had Parliamentary Secretary Megan Dykeman, both fantastic and motivated individuals. The thing that's a little bit awkward about the structure, for me anyway, is that the Parliamentary Secretary sits within the Ministry of Poverty Reduction and Social Development. And the nonprofit sector includes social services and those that focus on poverty reduction, but nonprofits encompass so much more than that as well. There's arts, there's sports, there's heritage and museums, there's all kinds of different nonprofits, professional associations. The list goes on. And the fact that this Parliamentary Secretary, which is responsible for all nonprofits, sits within social services and poverty reduction, I think can be confusing for organizations who are outside of the social services space. And while the idea behind it is to make sure all nonprofits feel like they matter and they're visible, with this particular placement, it can feel that some nonprofits maybe have greater visibility or a greater channel or access to that Parliamentary Secretary as compared to others, which, when the whole idea is to get beyond the spirit of competition and instead look at abundance and collective capacity and all of that, the sensitivities around where the position lives, I think all of that has to be considered. It's human beings who run these organizations. So people will have normal responses to and reactions to things, and setting it a bit more neutral, I think, outside of a specific ministry that has a focus within social service or within nonprofits would have been perhaps better.
Those are some great insights and learnings as the model has unfolded. So it's interesting. It takes time and effort for the sector to mobilize and have something like this implemented inside government. But these things aren't monoliths that never change. So recognizing the fact that the sector fought long and hard for inclusion in the machinery of government, how much continued advocacy has been needed to maintain these well-deserved gains? Or do you kind of get a sense that it's now simply part of the functioning of the provincial government in BC?
It's a great question. And I think it's a very, it's a big answer that I probably am going to want to give here, because I think that for me, this ties in really well, with what Vantage Point is doing to try to create this BC-wide nonprofit network. We're looking at Imagine Canada and the work you do nationally. We're looking at Ontario Nonprofit Network and impact organizations of Nova Scotia. And there's some provinces where that overarching overall voice for the nonprofit sector is stronger and more consolidated. And it's my view that those voices can actually engage with a home in government with more strength and credibility, I guess. Right now, it almost feels to me that we were advocating for something, the position was created, and then the sector hasn't necessarily known how best to utilize that position. So I think now that the position is there, we need to continue to advocate for that position to be maintained or to eventually grow into a ministerial role, because that would eliminate that earlier question that I mentioned about it sitting under a ministry. And, coming back to that question, people have then asked me, well, where do you think it would fit better? And I don't have an answer. I can't think of a ministry where it would make more sense than where it currently sits, but perhaps with greater advocacy, it could become a ministry of its own, which would neutralize those issues. But then, yes, like I'm saying, the nonprofit sector ourselves, we need to understand collectively how we want to be engaging with this person, this team, and what it is that we are trying to achieve. And so I think much of that is starting to become discovered, but I don't have a good handle myself. So it's maybe like the 5 key points that collectively everybody's standing behind and wanting to see from government. So some of our own internal strategic planning, for lack of a better phrase, I think is necessary, and hopefully can happen in partnership with the government, so that we can understand a little bit better what their priorities are and how we can find those win-win situations so that collectively we can be supporting communities better, because that's what all of our work is all about at the end of the day anyway, regardless of what hat we're wearing.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. Sometimes the size, scope, breadth of the sector is an enormous strength. But to your point around what are those key issues, it's often challenging to create consensus or agreement on what those are, given that very size, scope, and breadth of the sector. So it often is a bit of a double-edged sword. So we're going to ask now to maybe invite you to think a little bit about some advice for those who are working at a federal level, because you provided some great insights on the operation of a particular model in one province, both the positives, some of the challenges, some of the insights from the sectoral side. So as you think about the pursuit for a similar support system inside the federal government, what advice or suggestions might you have for sector leaders advocating for this important change?
Well, one of the things that I'm really heartened by is the fact that more and more organizations across different provinces and federally are talking to each other. And so we're sharing ideas, we're sharing stories, we're sharing experiences. And so collectively, there's a lot of knowledge. And the more that we share and talk to each other and learn from each other, the better outcome eventually we're going to get to. Maybe we'll find the secret sauce, together. So I would say, in terms of the advocacy piece at a federal level, to think carefully about where the position lives and to ensure that nonprofits are all on equal footing, regardless of their mission or their programming or geography or size. So sort of what I was hinting at or talking about prior, making sure that there's clarity of purpose, and that where this position lives in government makes sense and is logical for all the nonprofits that are represented through this type of work. In terms of nonprofits ourselves, I think it's really important for organizations to be able to put our regular issues aside and collectively advocate for larger systems change work that can make necessary improvements for everybody. I mean, my whole career up until this role, I've been in frontline service organizations, and it can be really hard to have the space and the time to start thinking about these systems levels issues or government relations. And so more support maybe from the government or engagement across nonprofits to build that capacity, I think would be really helpful so that there's more collective strength in terms of what we're trying to do. Because we do need to always take a nonpartisan approach, it's really important that nonprofits and organizations like yourselves are building relationships with ongoing staff of ministries and departments, regardless of political party. I think that's a really important point, because ultimately we want the work to live on and the importance of nonprofits to be recognized and validated regardless of who is the prime minister or which party's in power, because our work, it transcends that. And so I think that that's a really important piece as well. And finally, I truly believe that our sector is the safety net for society. We build communities that are strong, resilient, vibrant, and connected, where people feel that they can belong and where there's a high sense of community well-being. It's not an optional sector. It is essential. And we need to remember how powerful we can be when we come together and approach the relationship with government from this place of strength and true partnership. That's the vision that we hope for. And I do have faith that all of us from province to province and yourselves at a federal level, if we all continue to dance on the same dance floor, we'll get where we want to go.
Those are some great insights and observations for those of us working to achieve that goal or dream, if you will, at the federal level. And it's a particularly timely conversation. As we head into the fall season, there's a very strong push to ensure that a home in government for charities and nonprofits is part of the 2024 federal budget. And so organizations locally, provincially, federally are all working together now to see if we can actually realize that gaping hole inside our federal system right now. So Zahra, thank you so much for taking the time today to share your thoughts and reflections on what's happened in BC. Because as we said, there's not that many examples of where it's actually happening in Canada right now. And being able to learn from one province's history on this is super helpful. So thanks again for taking the time. It's really appreciated.
It was my pleasure. And I look forward to seeing where things go with Imagine and the work that you're doing. So best of luck. And I will be paying attention.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.